Welcome to today's webinar, where we're going to discuss optimizing outcomes in business relationships. My name is Patrick Gahagan, and I'm happy to speak with you today. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about the nature of enterprise relationships and how we can apply strategies from our personal relationships to enhance our enterprise relationships. We're also going to talk about some warning signs that can indicate that enterprise relationships are at risk. I want you to think for a moment about the 5 most impactful personal relationships in your lives. Who makes the cut? Spouses, parents, children? Those are obvious picks. What about coworkers or close friends? Maybe a pet. 2 of my wife's top 5 are Labrador Retrievers. Depending on where you live, your landlord might be a pretty impactful relationship. But what if we think more broadly? What about our relationships with money, or food, or even hobbies like exercise? I have a relationship with long-distance running. One of my colleagues has a peculiar relationship with CrossFit. Maybe you've heard of it. We may know people affected by unhealthy relationships with drugs or alcohol. If anyone here is a business owner, you may even have 1 or 2 clients in your top 5. I know I do. We talk a lot about partners and business relationships, or more precisely, enterprise relationships, but we don't often think about what those terms mean, or about our behaviors in the context of a relationship, or how our attitudes and company culture affect interactions between enterprises and business outcomes that result from those interactions. What about the question of the most 5 impactful relationships within your enterprise? Do the CFO and CMO give the same answer? What about the Chief Procurement Officer and the General Counsel or the head of HR? Which enterprise relationships matter the most really depends on your perspective. I find relationships between enterprises to be fascinating. We talk about enterprises like they're corporal beings, when really a corporation is just a legal entity, and the entity itself isn't sentient. It's the actions of its officers and employees. And some of those enterprises have a lot of employees. I read a press release recently that Samsung is making 100% of the screens for Apple's iPhone X. That's a massive relationship. What does it mean to say that Apple has a relationship with Samsung? Each one is independently one of the biggest companies in the world. Apple has over 100,000 employees. Samsung has over 275,000 employees. Together, that's roughly half the population of Washington, D.C. Can you imagine how many of each organization's employees are working with each other to make that relationship successful? It's probably hundreds or even thousands of personal relationships. Engineers of every stripe, lawyers, procurement professionals, sales professionals, manufacturing employees, auditors, accountants, thousands of interactions and thousands of personal relationships. And some of the folks on this call might point out that the relationship is really just the contract between them. And to a certain extent, that's true. A contract gives a relationship legal standing, just like a marriage license gives legal standing to a spouse. Legal standing is important and it's certainly worth the effort, but it will never define the quality of a relationship. The contract itself does not ensure the desired business outcomes. People, and probably a few robots, have to do the hard work. That's why I've come to the conclusion that business relationships, particularly enterprise relationships, are really just personal relationships at scale. And once I started looking at enterprise relationships through the lens of personal relationships, I immediately noticed some similarities to my own life experiences. Namely, enterprise relationships are hard to start, especially from the sell side. Then it takes a lot of work to keep both sides happy. We don't always communicate our expectations very well. Relationships can also be deeply affected by culture, origin myths, and vision. Culture defines external interactions as much as it defines internal interactions. And in spite of challenges, enterprise relationships can last a long time. There's a saying that the rituals last long after the reasons why have been forgotten. And sometimes our relationships outlast their utility. I think of this whenever I hear the phrase, "That's how we've always done things." But relationships and enterprise relationships are no exception, do end. And when they do end, it can be very messy. And sometimes we don't appreciate the truly special relationships until they're over. So why does all this matter? And why am I taking time to talk about this in a webinar? I think it matters because if we can learn what makes relationships enduring, and if we can learn how to optimize our relationships to produce desired business outcomes, then it's easier to modify our attitudes and behaviors at the personal level and thus produce the greatest value at the enterprise level. So I've been a contract auditor for over 15 years. And during that time, I've been privileged to work with some of the biggest companies in the world and review intimate details of some of their most important business relationships. A lot of people think of auditors as the police, but I don't think that's the right metaphor. I really think of auditors more like marriage counselors, but with calculators. And before any auditor can evaluate a relationships in the context of an audit, we have to build a deep understanding of how that relationship began, what's worked, what hasn't, and what expectations are being met or unmet from each side's perspective. And an auditor needs that context before they can look at factors around compliance with anything approaching understanding, especially for the underlying root causes. And I've found by having hundreds and if not thousands of these conversations that it's fascinating how much perspectives can differ. So from the buy side, we might ask, is the work being done to acceptable standards? Are timelines being met? Are budget expectations being met? Are invoices being submitted timely? What part of the business process is creating pain, if any? Is there misalignment within the organization around how to manage a supplier? A common phrase I've heard is, procurement wants to get rid of this advertising agency, but the CMO won't let us. Sometimes it's, procurement wants to get rid of this value-added reseller, but the chief technology officer won't let us. Well, our question is, why do you want to get rid of the agency? Let's talk about that. And it's amazing how often internal misalignment expresses itself as external misalignment. But we don't just have conversations on the buy side, we talk on the sell side too, and we ask a lot of the same questions. We also ask, what's hard about working with our client? What is our client doing that drives you nuts? Does our client approve and pay your invoices within the agreed terms? What are the most frustrating things that happened in the last month other than this audit? These conversations really help us as an auditor understand where a relationship falls within what we call the enterprise relationship lifecycle. And that context informs our approach to each audit. So let's talk about the enterprise relationship lifecycle for a moment. And before I start, I want to point out this is simply based on observations that my colleagues and I have had as auditors. I can't point to academic research supporting this, and some of the folks on this call may disagree with some of the stages or how we've arranged them. I can't claim that this life cycle is universal. I'm sure there's exceptions, but on average, this is how me and my colleagues see enterprise relationships cycling on a day-to-day basis. And specifically, the trust life cycle, as with any life cycle, has to start somewhere. And where we start that cycle is blind trust. Obviously, with experience, two parties can reach a place of earned trust, and that's really important. We'll talk about that in greater detail here in a minute. With effective communication and what we call mutual accommodations, that relationship can ultimately get to what we call ultimate trust, where optimization is occurring. Ultimate trust takes a lot of work. It's very hard to maintain. And often, after time, accountability decreases. And if that happens, it's possible for relationships to dip into mistrust. Now, when that happens, in many cases, a relationship will end. But it doesn't have to, and it's possible to restore trust. And we think transparency is the key to doing that. So let's talk about these stages in a little more detail. And I think to do that, we really need to start with trust. And we all know that trust is the heart of every relationship, but it can be somewhat of a nebulous thing. And that's why I feel that reducing trust to its core components is so helpful. This formula was created by an individual, Charles Green. I find it's the best representation I've been able to find on what the core components of trust are. And the way he defines it is that trust is credibility plus reliability plus intimacy divided by self-orientation. So each of these components is critical, and in order to grow trust, you need to maximize the numerator, which is the top line, and minimize the denominator, which is the bottom line. It cannot be one-sided. It has to be owned by both sides, and I can't overstate this enough. We spend so much time oriented around our own trust of others, either at the personal or enterprise level, that we don't spend enough time thinking about whether we ourselves are trustworthy, whether our own behaviors and attitudes enhance trust or decrease it. And another thing is, it really doesn't matter how much more leverage the buy side or the sell side has over the other. It takes two to trust. So blind trust. This is where every enterprise relationship has to start. And there are many service providers out there right now that do really impressive work for their clients at the beginning of relationships to mitigate the risk of blind trust. So things like reference checks, credit checks, insurance requirements, financial health assessments, for some of us, Google searches, sophisticated 100-page master services agreement. A lot of work goes into making sure potential partners are credible. In the consumer market, a big reason that companies like Uber and Amazon are successful is their ability to bridge the gap between buyers and sellers. I was recently at a conference and asked others in the room how many folks in that room got to the conference by getting into the car of a random stranger they met on the internet. And not surprisingly, many hands went up, including my own, because we used Uber to get to that conference. We weren't worried about being kidnapped. We weren't worried about being harmed, and the person who drove us wasn't worried about being stiffed a fare. I think that's pretty amazing. At the enterprise level, we don't quite have the same universal systems, but there are examples. Managed service providers and group procurement organizations are two examples of how some enterprises try to bridge the blind trust gap by pre-screening potential partners and only allowing credible players onto the platform. But let's be honest, a lot of times we take the leap. We sign a contract, we issue a PO, and we cross our fingers. So experience. Experience is where we start transacting with each other. This is each side's opportunity to establish reliability. Goods and services delivered on time and at the level of quality and price advertised, followed by timely payment. Both sides upholding their end of the bargain and following through on promises. We start small, assess, and hopefully grow. Terms I see used frequently are pilot project and proof of concept. I think we like to dip our toes in because diving headfirst into dark waters is dangerous. And when the total value meaning the service provided minus the cost, begins to exceed expectations, volume tends to scale quickly. And this is a fine place for any enterprise relationship to live. It's transactional. It isn't necessarily providing strategic value to either party, but it is providing value. Reliability is present, and the actions of both sides are predictable. Do this over time, and trust is going to grow. Which brings us to earn trust. And at this stage of the life cycle, we have started to earn trust with each other. We may not be partners yet, but the level of credibility and reliability has risen to a point where intimacy can develop. So what does intimacy look like in an enterprise relationship? I think we all understand what intimacy looks like in a personal relationship, but I don't think we spend a lot of time considering that in our enterprise relationships. I think it means that we're honest with each other about our expectations. I think it means that we share relevant, confidential information about future plans. It means we are honest about business practices that are causing pain or friction. And it might even mean that we talk about prices if the amount being paid is higher or lower than the market and thus unsustainable. And most of all, I believe it means that we embrace openness and transparency. Now, when we think about enterprise relationships, it's probable that one party to that relationship is going to have more power or leverage than the other. How is that power dynamic managed? Is it managed with mutual respect? Is the side with less power and leverage able to raise concerns with confidence that the other side will listen with empathy? Empathy is really important here. I see it all the time in our audits where a supplier doesn't bring up issues because they don't believe it will help. They don't believe anyone will listen. So a potential fixable issue is left unresolved to fester, and that's a really easy way for dangerous feelings like contempt and resentfulness to take hold. Now, every organization's culture has a part to play here, and some organizations are simply not going to be intimate with other enterprises. That doesn't mean they can't be successful, especially if they're strong internally. You want to make sure, however, that it's a conscious decision and aligned with management's strategy for growth and innovation. For those enterprises that are willing to take the risk, transparency and open communication can unlock significant value for both organizations. I have a story to illustrate this. So one of my clients is a well-known brand. They have a long relationship with a media agency, and operationally, the relationship is excellent. Financially, however, my client signed a suboptimal contract. Not intentionally so, but they agreed to quite a few unfavorable terms simply because they didn't understand them. There were limits on transparency, poorly defined compensation, restrictions on what they could audit and who they could hire to do the audit, and what kind of compensation arrangement they could have with that auditor. Despite these suboptimal restrictions, the situation turned out okay, because my client was able to sit down with that agency and say, look, we know we signed a bad contract, shame on us, but we want to have a good relationship. And the only way to have a good relationship going forward is if we have a clear understanding of what's happened in the past. So we know that we're not legally entitled to this transparency, but we're asking you to allow it for the good of our collective relationship. So what happened? The agency agreed. They consented to a host of disclosures they didn't legally have an obligation to consent to. And this was uncomfortable. They had made a lot more money than our client had realized. But placing the facts on the table gave all parties a chance to re-engage on a level playing field. I believe in the long run, this relationship will be immensely stronger because my client and its agency can make mutual accommodations with each other that meet each side's needs going forward. So mutual accommodations. This is the inflection point that unlocks strategic value. And it can only be achieved after both sides have actually achieved real intimacy. Mutual accommodations are about changes to our pricing, our practices, and our business processes to better meet the needs of another enterprise. These accommodations are usually uncomfortable and they have a real cost. But if done right, the value provided to the receiving party will exceed the cost to the giver. And if the accommodations are mutual, then the net effect is an overall increase in value for everyone. The pie is made bigger. But in order to do this, communication has to be real, it has to be intimate, and it cannot be based on assumptions. Look, making accommodations effectively takes creativity. It requires a deep understanding of your organization's own priorities and, importantly, those of your partner. This is how you can optimize the accommodations in a way that minimizes cost and maximizes benefit, which is how maximum value will be produced. You cannot assume the other side is optimizing for the same thing that you are. Looking at some examples here makes this easy to understand. So a very common trade-off is reducing cost in exchange for increasing volume. Any sell-side individual listening to this will certainly be able to think of instances where they've accepted lower margins in return for increased volume of business. I know I have. But that's not the only way these accommodations can go. There's probably also buy-side folks who are listening to this who've accepted paying a higher margin for a good or service in return for a higher quality or greater innovation. In my personal life, I call this buy once, cry once. Accommodations can be really way more interesting and value generating beyond these simple examples I've given. Integration of systems, gain share arrangements, efficiencies from platforms or new technologies like AI or RPO. There's so much innovation happening right now that really opens the door to unique accommodations. And folks listening to this call can probably think of some great examples of how they creatively used mutual accommodations to help a partner better optimize for a particular need. For instance, we can't overlook areas like sustainability or corporate social responsibility. There are some companies really distinguishing themselves in this space and earning many new clients in the process. I'll tell another example that isn't financial in nature. So recently, we were having some challenges with one of our clients. We were doing audits, and those Audits were leading to some significant findings, and suppliers were issuing credits to resolve those findings. And some of these credits were big, close to $1 million, even more. So we would send these credits to a shared service center based overseas, and they would essentially go into a black hole. We'd follow up for weeks and weeks, and then after about a month, we'd get an email that would say that, something like the supplier had a different number, or the company code didn't match a cost center, so it couldn't be processed. And this was frustrating. Our client was losing out on the time value of processing these credits quickly, and it was taking a lot of everyone's time for what appeared to be a simple process to happen. So, recognizing the frustration this was causing and seeing the potential value of improving the process, my client gave our team read-only access to their payable system, which allowed our team to monitor credit processing in real time and get in front of issues arising from what was an understandably complex environment. Now, credits that used to take 3 to 6 months to process are completed in a day or two. That's a massive improvement for everyone. So, that accommodation certainly had a cost. Setting up a third party for read-only access to a system is not easy, but it was done, and since it's been done, it's realized tremendous benefit for everyone. So, if both parties are making mutual accommodations,